Title updates are major additions to Monster Hunter games that add monsters, gear, event quests, and more. The games have consistently been getting them since Monster Hunter World, and they have always been free. Title updates are generally loved by fans. It's always exciting when a new one comes out, as they give everyone something new to do and keep a sense of fresh excitement going long after the game's initial release. But as of late, people have perhaps soured on them slightly, and this is because of Monster Hunter Wild's first title update. It includes the Bubble Fox Wyvern Mizutsune, an arch-tempered form of Rey Dau, a refightable high-rank version of the final boss, Shia, and a new gathering hub for the game. It's a pretty sizable update, but it happened so quickly after launch that it became clear that this was just stuff they either could not finish in time for release, or worse, had intentionally cut away for the sake of having a title update, leaving the $70 base game feeling incomplete for a whole month. Mizutsune was in the previous game, and realistically should not have been difficult to bring over to Wilds. No Monster Hunter game had launched without a gathering hub before, and Shia is the first final boss to not have any weapons or armor, because they were saved for the update. At launch, he was a one-time encounter as well. Wilds as a whole doesn't tend to run very well, especially on PC, and the large amount of bugs and glitches indicate that the game may have been rushed to meet a release date. It sold 10 million copies in a month, and when you consider that it doesn't seem finished, it does beg the question, if success was guaranteed, could the game not have just been delayed? Today I want to talk about title updates, the effect they've had on Monster Hunter games, their importance, and whether or not they've been good for the series overall. This is the first video I've made discussing Wilds at length, so I must disclose that Capcom provided me with the game code. World, Iceborne, Rise and Sunbreak all received different title updates after launch. I'm going to keep this as brief as I can, as I do not want the history of title updates to be the main focus of this video. Deviljho came to Monster Hunter World 2 months after the game's initial release on the 22nd of March 2018. He's an invading monster that can be fought in every region. Kolv came a month later after that on the 19th of April. She is an elder dragon who serves as a siege, where hunters would have to work together to face off against her numerous times and break as many parts as possible in a new mini-locale known as the Caverns of El Dorado. Next came Lunastra, Teostra's female counterpart who had not been seen since the PSP games. She was added on May 31st, a month after Kolv and just 4 months after the base game's initial release. The next update was bigger, a collaboration with Final Fantasy XIV, featuring a whole questline involving a powered-up Kuliaku, meeting Moogle, and facing Behemoth, who was designed for you to face him with other hunters using traditional JRPG roles. This came 7 months after World's release. Its final major update was also a collaboration, this time with The Witcher, where you played as Geralt and faced off against the Leshen. From the Lunastra update onwards, Arch-Tempered Elder Dragons were also released, with each further updates. This started with Kirin and included Teostra, Kushala, but even Kolv, Lunastra, basically every Elder Dragon, and finally Nergigante, who was even given a unique theme. Iceborne's post-launch support was a bit different. Rajang came first, a month after the expansion's release, along with the whole Guiding Lands region. Following him was Stygian Zinogre and Safi Jiva 2 months after that. This update expanded the endgame even more, as it included a Tundra Guiding Lands region, and Safi Jiva was a siege, just like Kolv. 3 months later in March 2020, Raging Brachydios and Furious Rajang were added into the game. Arch-Tempered Namiel and a Master Rank version of Kolv came a month later. Kolv was now killable, and would cycle on a rotation with Safi Jiva, so they were never available at the same time. 3 months later in July, Elatrion and Frostfang Barioth came to the game. This update was actually supposed to come in May, but it took a little while longer than normal as the COVID-19 pandemic had spread worldwide, and many studios had to transition over to remote work, which took some time. And 3 months after that, Fatalis and Arch-Tempered Velkhana were added. This was Iceborne's final update. The next game was Rise, which also received some title updates. The first came a month after release, and it featured Apex Diablos, Apex Rathalos, Chameleos, Kushala Deora, Teostra, and Bazelgeuse. Yes, that's how you say his name. A very meaty update indeed, so close to launch. The update after that came a month later, and it brought Crimson Glow Valstrax, a new variant of a monster who wasn't yet in the game, which essentially meant he was a new addition. It also added Apex Zinogre and Nawa the Allmother, a new tougher variant of the final boss. Moving on to the Sunbreak expansion, the first update for that was it for Rise. 2 major updates, both within the launch period, and after that it was just minor stuff. Sunbreak, however, went a lot further. Sunbreak released on the 30th of June 2022. Its first update, just over a month after release on the 10th of August, brought in the Forlorn Arena as well as Lucent's Nagakuga, a rare species that hadn't been seen since the Wii U was a thing. It also had Silver Rathalos, Gold Rathian and Seething Bazelgeuse. The next updates came on the 29th of September, just under 2 months later, featuring Violent Mizutsune, Flaming Espinas and Risen Chameleos. Update 3 came 2 months after that, on the 24th of November. This featured Risen Kushala the Aura and Risen Teostra, but also Chaotic Gore Magala. You might be noticing a trend here that these are all variations of base game monsters. Rathalos, Nagakuga, Mizutsune and Espinas were all in Sunbreak, and now their harder, rare and subspecies were coming in to be more difficult after launch. Risen Dragons were a brand new tier of powered up monster too, and were so much tougher than the base forms. On the 7th of February 2023, Update 4 ended the variant's trend. It came just 2 months after Update 3 and brought in Velkhana from Iceborne, which funnily enough makes her the first non-variant update monster since Bazorgi's all the way in Rise. Risen Crimson Glow Valstrax was also included. Another 2 months after that, on the 20th of April, Tassel Update 5 added Amatsu, a returning final boss and the only non-5th generation monster to come in a title update for Sunbreak. He's fought in an existing arena, has story relevance, and is very much a visual spectacle. Risen Shigaru Magala was also in this update. Sunbreak didn't get a 6th title update. Instead, Primordial Malzeno, the final variant, was added 2 months later on the 8th of June, almost a whole year after Sunbreak released. Like Amatsu, Primordial was relevant to the story and sort of gives it a true epilogue ending. Title Update 1 also introduced a new endgame system called Anomaly Investigations. You'd receive randomized quests and would level up over time, and each update would increase the level cap, add more afflicted monsters, expand the materials you could gain, and the weapon upgrades you could make. Title Update 4 incorporated the Risen Dragons into the system too. That is about as brief of a summary as I can make. I made a point to talk about the timeframes of each update. You might notice that World was very haphazard and somewhat unorganised in this aspect, which is not the case for later entries, which largely managed to release their updates at a fairly consistent rate, excluding Iceborne, which had good reasons. But generally, they'll try to get their early titled updates out fast. Iceborne, Rise, Sunbreak, and now I guess Wilds all try to have their first 2 updates out within the first 3 months. Title updates give existing players something new to do, which helps the game feel more fresh and creates a pretty big buzz online. Consider Rajang and Deviljho, who are not only rather difficult, but can also be fought anywhere and have numerous turf wars against fellow iconic monsters. They're designed to be very versatile and ultimately get people to really engage with them. But the main reason they come out so fast is to motivate casual players to come back to the game and keep playing. When most people finish a game and put it down, they're not likely to come back because why would they? They've had their fill and are all good. Iceborne and Sunbreak have sold just over half of their base game's totals, which means a huge chunk of people who beat World and Rise did not feel like coming back. Personally, most of my friends who casually tried Rise and enjoyed it did not play Sunbreak. So Capcom wants to recapture people who might have beaten Shia or maybe even Arkveld and put the game down. The main story, the final boss, that's their big and I'd argue primary goal with these early title updates as of late. They do this by releasing them fast, but how do they do that in just a month? This is perhaps obvious to most of you, but the early title updates are always worked on prior to the game's release. This is the case for a lot of update or DLC content in video games. In a recent video I made on Rise, I discussed how Xenoblade 3's massive story expansion, that was basically a whole small JRPG, came out not so long after the main game's release, and how it was very apparent that much of it was worked on before it was out. It's standard practice. So Deviljho, Kulve Taroth, Rajang and Safi Jiva were worked on to a degree before World and Iceborne respectively released. This, however, does not mean they were meant to be in World and Iceborne's base releases. Much of the time, they were always planned to be in title updates from the very beginning. That being said, there is the occasional updates monster that was not ready for the base release, and rather than delay the whole package, Capcom instead opt to just release the monster later. This doesn't happen that often. A notable case would be Stygian Zenogre, who would have been in the base release of Iceborne if Zenogre himself wasn't a late edition. The developers have been very open about this. Working on the early title updates before release lets them be ready very quickly, but it also allows for the developers to buffer them up in a way and immediately get started on future monsters. If Deviljho and Rajang are ready to go, they can immediately get to work finishing up Kulve Taroth and Safi Jiva. Even later on you can see the developers doing this. Velkhana, being a relatively easy port from Iceborne, allowed the developers to focus on Amatsu and Primordial Malzeno, who were much trickier to implement. Deviljho and Rajang could have been in the base releases, but World and Iceborne did not feel incomplete without them, and felt better with them. This is important because it ties into why people were so annoyed with Wilds. Locking a refightable version of the final boss behind an update is a weird choice. When I beat Shia and he wasn't refightable, I assumed that he would return. I think everyone did. But I thought he'd be, revamped like Nawa the All-Mother or best case scenario Safijiva. But this is just a high rank version. Why hold him back? It has to be said again, but no Monster Hunter has launched without a gathering hub before. Technically, Wilds lets you see other players in the villages, but it's not the same thing. And then there's Mizutsune. Look, I like Mizutsune. But there's a reason Wild and Iceborne bringing back Rajang and Deviljho was so cool. It's because they were remakes of iconic monsters who hadn't been seen in some time. Even Rise and Sunbreak, despite their first updates featuring monsters seen in previous games, made sure to headline Chameleos and Lucent Nagakuga, as they were monsters we had not seen in a long time. Mizutsune was in the last game, and like Velkhana and Sunbreak, surely did not take that much extra work to require a whole extra month of development time. He does have a new mode, where his bubbles become a flame, and he gains access to new attacks, but those are pretty much what Apex Mizutsune had, who was also in Rise. People were miffed because Wilds felt blatantly unfinished. It was missing key features from previous games, was really buggy, and very unoptimized on PC. Mizutsune is probably the least bad part of this update, but he's still not very impressive on paper. Essentially, if they really needed one extra month, why not just delay the game instead of launching without a refightable final boss or gathering hub? Truth is, a delay would have ensured the game is more stable and runs better, but in my opinion, Shia and the Grand Hub would have always come later, because that's how they were designed. Title updates are important for the reasons mentioned earlier, but an important aspect about them is that they're also marketing pushes. They get pushed into people's news feeds and keep the game fresh in people's minds and in conversations. This again contributes to people coming back to the game, but it also brings in new people who see the game getting updates and think, hey, that looks interesting. I think you can confidently say that Worlds updates and Iceborne's back-to-back hits massively contributed to them both becoming massive successes. All those big updates were across a 3-year period, and actually tricked a fair amount of people into believing World was a live service MMO that would be supported forever. World effectively stayed in people's conversations for 3 solid years thanks to title updates, but it also means they're extremely important for the long-term successes of these games. I talked about this in my Monster Hunter Rise and Storm Serpents videos, but the reason the first 2 updates for that game were so big and meaty is because they're just Rise's post-game, sliced off and released in 2 batches. The prevailing opinion was that, like Iceborne, COVID-19 was the reason this had to happen, which would make sense, but I disagree. If you assume those 6 monsters in the first update were not ready for launch, do you really think a month's delay was all they needed to fix every single one of them up? I've read a fair bit about Rise's development, and my understanding is that the game was initially going to be a higher quality iteration of the 3DS games, until Monster Hunter World forced them to really make a game on par with it. Modern graphics, open locales, and I do think Rise's post-launch support was similar. Most of the content is similar to the 3DS games, event quests and armors, to the point I think it was only going to be this. But the pressure to be more like World meant they would also need title updates, so my theory is that they sliced off the post-game and released it as 2 big updates, purely for the sake of having them, and to give the game a better relevance boost for 2 months. And that's the issue. I think the MO now is to intentionally hold back key features and offer monsters to make the updates feel bigger and more impressive. Realistically, the average person won't stick around for a single monster, no matter how cool they are. Giving them 2 or 3 or even 6, I guess, helps solve that issue. But this sucked for Rise because it's essentially compromised the game. I think it would have been far better received if it launched with the post-game intact. It would not have had any big updates, but if Capcom were upfront, then I don't think people would have gone in expecting them either. Sunbreak also did the big meaty update strategy that might just be held back content. Lucent Nagakuga and the Forlorn Arena were the headliners of the first title update, which is cool, but Silver Athos and Gold Rathian were in Iceborne. Did they really need an extra month for Sunbreak? We know it's not that hard to put them in. I will defend it by pointing out that those 2 rare species are typically associated with the Forlorn Arena, so maybe holding them back made sense. But what's Seething Basil's excuse? Sunbreak's later updates were fine, but the Anomaly Investigation's drip feeding was a bit egregious. It took them quite some time to fill out the Afflicted monster roster, and you had to keep waiting for the cap to increase with the next update. Similar to the Grand Hub in Wilds, the games also drip-fed other features. Layered weapons only became a thing later in Iceborne's updates, which was fine, given it was a new feature. But then Rise didn't have them until Sunbreak's second update. The mechanic existed within the game, as Rampage weapons could be freely layered, but we still had to wait. And as of this video, Wilds does not have the feature either. Will we have to wait until the expansion? Arguably, this drip feeding started with Iceborne. The guiding lands at launch only had 4 regions, which only made up 4 of the game's 6 locales. Like the other first updates, the regions were likely held back to make the content drops feel big and substantial. You can even see a glimpse of the volcano in a pre-release trailer. Many people found Ruin Energigante underwhelming when they finally unlocked him, because he felt very similar to the base form. Tempered Ruin Energigante was added with Title Update 1, and he actually has moveset differences, which implies that once again, they were held back for this version. Rise, Sunbreak and now Wilds have doubled down on this method. On some level, either small or extreme, these games are never going to feel complete ever again, because having big title updates is seen as more important. This especially is bad if you remember the older games. Take Monster Hunter Portable Third. In terms of post-game content, it had Amatsu, the final boss, but also the Metal Wraths, Akantor, Eukanlos, Gen Moran and Elatrion. In a modern release, how many of those do you think would be updates? Generations had around 12 deviants, each with weapons, armors and their own questlines. You can be certain that a modern game would launch with like 3, and then slowly release the rest over time. Or take Monster Hunter 4, which had Dalamadeur, Akantor, Fatalis, Crimson Fatalis, the Metal Wraths, Furious Rajang and Savage Deviljho, all at launch, on the cartridge. 4 Ultimate took it further. Eukanlos, Gogmazios, Raging Brachydios, Shah Dalamadeur, G-Rank Crimson Fatalis, Old Fatalis, not to mention everyone from the base game, on the cartridge at launch. You could be certain that Wilds would slowly drip feed them over time. You wanna know why? Because that's what 4 Ultimate did. Yes, the base game had Crimson Fatalis on the cartridge, with all his gear intact, perfectly playable, but you had to wait for Capcom to release his event quest. Until then, it's like he didn't even exist. G-Rank was worse about this, as it locked Hub Gore Magala, Silver Athlos and Gold Rathian, Fatalis, Dalamadeur and Old Fatalis behind events. Again, they were on the cartridge, ready to go, but we had to wait for Capcom to release the events. Part of this follows the same MO as in World, where monsters like Nergigante or Valhazak were not in Master Rank, because we had Ruin Nergigante and Black Veil Valhazak. The need for Gore Magala, Fatalis or Dalamadeur is offset by Chaotic Gore, Crimson Fatalis and Shard Dalamadeur being available in the hub, and unlike World, at least we got the base monsters eventually. But waiting months for Silver and Gold as well as Old Fatalis, despite them being ready to go on the cartridge, is actually way worse than what happens now. With modern title updates, there's an actual team of people working on them as we speak. Sure, we had to wait for Shia, but that gives them time to work on Lagiacrus, who I do not believe is ready to release right now, and whoever else will appear in later title updates. And while Monster Hunter 4, Portable Third, Generations and other games had a lot of this end content in the game from the very beginning, while title updates have to come later, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because they release independently from the game, the content in them has more time and manpower allocated towards them, and this is often reflected in the quality. World's weapon designs ended up quite bad across the board, with lots of recycled designs that were just bone or iron with monster parts glued on, because the staff did not have enough time to have dozens of original designs in high definition graphics. With the exception of Stygian Zinogre and I believe Lunastra, all title update monsters have their weapon designs intact. This includes Raging Brachydios, whose original form in Iceborne has plenty of slap-on weapons. They could have just reused them for the variant, but because they had more time, they could actually finish off the real designs. In fact, most if not all title update monsters are of such incredibly high quality of which I'm not sure they'd be able to achieve if they had to cram them into the base game. Take Deviljho, who has numerous turf wars with various apex monsters and has the ability to pick up smaller monsters and chuck them around. Or Lunastra, who for the first time no longer feels like a lesser Teostra, with advanced fire mechanics and even a bond attack. Behemoth is quite frankly incredible, as he pretty much forced hunters to fight like they're in a JRPG party, with DPS, tank and healer roles, not to mention Extreme Behemoth, who ended up being the most iconic challenger in the game. Raging Brachydios was in for Ultimate at launch, and he might be a contender for the most annoying fight in the series, but when they brought him back to Iceborne, he became one of the best fights of all time, partially because his exploding slime became far less annoying, but also due to his final stand mechanic, where he locks down an area in the Guiding Lands where nobody can leave and fights you to the death, with a completely new theme playing. The last stand takes place in a specific Guiding Lands area, and the developers said they did not have Raging Brachydios in mind when creating it. That means this idea only came much later. If Raging Brachydios was present at launch, we might never have experienced this. And in no reality could they have managed to have Elatrion and Fatalis in the base game as they are. Elatrion having so many new attacks, all his gear intact, Eschaton Judgment. Sure, Fatalis might have been in Monster Hunter 4's base game, but Iceborne Fatalis is undeniably the better fight and is so much higher quality. So many new attacks, mechanics, visual spectacles, music. If they managed to have this in Iceborne at release, a lot of other things would have suffered massively. I have nothing positive to say about Rise's post-launch, but I really enjoyed Sunbreaks. I actually love subspecies and variants, and there weren't that many of them on release, so it was nice to get more over time. Variants are easier to make than fully new or returning monsters, and so this lets them put out at least 3 for the first few updates. The Risen Dragons are incredible. They have considerable visual and moveset differences that really set them apart from their base form and make them really tough endgame challenges. Title Update 4 seemed really underwhelming at first for similar reasons to Wild's first update. Yeah, Velkhana is cool, but if I wanted to fight her, I would just go back to Iceborne. Why even bring her into this game? Well, the nature of Velkhana being an update monster meant more time was put into her, and that meant she finally received some good turf wars, the best in the series really. I've long suspected that Sunbreak initially had 3 updates greenlit from the beginning, while 4 and 5 were purely planned after release. Title Update 4 was deceptively big. It gave us Risen Crimson Glow Valstrikes but also hazard quests, where the target monster would often have physical moveset differences that went beyond simple statistic buffs. I discussed them in a previous video, but Lucent Nagakuka has so many upgrades. His fight is changed in such a major way that makes the original feel rather unsatisfying now. Other hazards include every single Risen Dragon, Flaming Espionage, Violent Mizutsune, and they don't always massively change the movesets, but they do feel different. And I don't think hazards are the kind of thing we would get at launch. Monster Hunter 4 did have the occasional quest with altered monster AI, but not to this extent. It really shows you the value of having a team of developers working on new additions after release. And then of course, Amatsu and Primordial Malzeno as the final updates, where we know for certain that without title updates, they would never have been in Sunbreak. That's why Amatsu's storyline was handled weirdly, in case you were curious. He was never really going to be in the game until later on. This is also why Primordial Malzeno was shifted to a later update. So having certain types of content as title updates does allow for them to be of a higher quality than you'd expect from a base game release, as they get a higher focus and more time is put into them. I mentioned that Capcom will sometimes hold back key features to make updates feel bigger, which sucks, but they do also add new features that clearly were not planned from the beginning. A key example is Sunbreak's Title Update 3. The followers at launch could only accompany you on specific follower quests or support surveys. These were solo only and completely separate from the main quests. Followers were very helpful companions, as they assisted you and they didn't affect health scaling. Title Update 3 allowed for followers to come on any Master Rank quest, except for events, and I don't think this feature was initially the plan, because it made support surveys totally pointless. There's no reason in making a specific follower quest for Espionage, if you can just bring followers to the regular quest, you know? Case in point, they stopped adding new ones after this update. Looking at Wilds, while Mizutsune as the first update is slightly underwhelming, it's cool that they gave him this new Soulseer mode. Despite him being a mid-game threat, there is now a bit of spice to the fight, making him dangerous in more ways. The tempered version is significantly harder too, and great for endgame players. And objectively, the Grand Hub is the most ambitious multiplayer zone they've ever made. The amount of work that's gone into this place is really impressive, especially when you consider the amount of players it can hold at once. I do consider Shia to be pure drip feeding. I'm not sure why the high rank version would be delayed, if not to just pad out content like that. Ultimately, I think title updates have been good for Monster Hunter games, by providing us with higher quality content than what we'd get from the initial releases of the game or expansion. However, it's undeniable that key features get relegated to the early updates in order to pad them out, and make them look really substantial, and this often makes the release version of the game feel bare or unfinished. Sometimes disastrously so, when you consider Monster Hunter Rise. I've seen a lot of anger online about Wilds feeling unfinished or incomplete. After looking at the previous games, I personally believe that if you really care about Monster Hunter games feeling incomplete, to the point you would regret buying them at launch, I would probably recommend waiting until the second title update is out. Based on patterns, that will be when all the ready for launch but safe for updates, and not ready for launch, therefore it's an update monsters will be out. And it's title update 3 onwards where the truly new content starts dropping. In the case of Iceborne, it would have been after Safi Jiva was released. For Rise, Valstrikes, Sunbreak's monster count and endgame felt sufficient to me after its second update, and with Wilds... So I do think Wilds' later title updates will be more akin to Behemoth, Elatrion, Velkhana and the Hazards, and maybe even Fatalis in terms of quality, but I do hope Capcom finds a way to make the early updates feel substantial in a way that does not detract from the base game. That would be better. And it does bear repeating, title updates are free. They've always been free, and hopefully always will be. When you consider the production values of some of these update monsters, particularly the later ones, it's all the more impressive. This is worth commending because they easily could have justified charging people extra for monsters like Elatrion, Fatalis, or Amatsu, who required a lot of work to implement, and so I do think that's worth keeping in mind. I said I love subspecies, and for that reason I think Sunbreak's post-launch was probably my favourite. Variations are easier for them to work on, and I think if they want the updates to feel bigger, it's not a bad approach at all. That's generally how I feel about the state of title updates. The launch period ones aren't the best, but the later ones get very spicy. If getting a complete experience at launch is a big concern, you should probably hold off on getting the games until the launch period updates are out. But the later ones are fabulous, and do genuinely add content of a caliber we would not get in the older games, let alone the base releases of the modern ones, as the workload being focused allows them to really shine later on. Thank you for watching this video. I'm curious to know what everyone's favourite title update is in any of the games they've played. For me, it's Sunbreak's 4th update, purely because of the hazards. That was a really cool and unexpected addition, and I'd love to see more of this stuff in the future. But what about you guys? Let me know in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.